So I'm here today with my associate Chad Kimsey, and we're going to discuss essentially the culmination of what's been really a 2.5 year investigation that encompasses how movements like the Jacobins, the Fabian Society, Marxism, Leninism, and collectivism in general are all fruits from the same tree. So, Chad, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate you letting me out of my cage to do this. I'm just playing.
Only for a little while, though.
What? You promised at least a day. Anyway, in case the audience doesn't know, sometimes I help Ben out whenever he is swamped, as he always is, with my special skills, which are top secret. Anyways,
yeah, so
it's great to be on, and I'm excited to discuss this with you.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. So I think that the place to really start with this is just to give people an idea of how exactly communist ideology infiltrates a free people and can flip them to being authoritarian when they don't even really recognize it, and or to even maybe accepting that ideology, thinking that it's right and knowing what they're doing. And I think that part of that difficulty comes from the fact that communism is very undefinable, which means that when one little experiment fails, they can go, well, that wasn't true communism. I'm going to do it better. And then they think that they can do it better and play God. So, do you want to start by just defining a little bit of how communist ideology seeps into people?
Of course, I'd be happy to. So, communist ideology is actually elusive because there's no set definition for communism. Communism is the end goal. So let's say you and I are Marxists. Well, Lenin shows up and now I'm a Marxist Leninist, but you stay a Marxist, which is kind of it kind of encompasses the ideology of the society that will lead to communism. So, collectivism is kind of where it started. It's just an old word for the collective, and basically it just means that whatever problems arise, whenever citizens have an issue that they want resolved, whether it be you next door to me coughing your lungs out. I'm going to use the coronavirus here as an example. Instead of me walking over and knocking on your door and asking if you're okay, we all know that there's this really infectious virus going around right now. And I'll just go ahead and call the cops or call the government, who basically represent force. So I'm calling force to take care of an issue that could be otherwise remedied by me just knocking on your door and asking, hey, can you keep it down? So, and that's kind of what collectivism is. It's the government is the solution to most of man's problems. If they have a problem and you wish to improve it, the government being the legal use of force to ensure they take care of the issue, no matter the personal cost to anyone involved or indirectly involved. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great definition, or just to set up the scene for exactly how communism works here. I mean, so much of it is based on principles of, well, when we're figured out, you just change out the agents and you change the names, but you keep the same agenda. You just rebrand it. And we've seen that so many times in America, just in the last century even. I mean, we see, especially with the Soviet Union, and then you have the McCarthyism in America, and it made it very difficult. Like you were saying, communism is undefinable, or it's a very loose definition at best. And I mean, we look at the way that it's rebranded nowadays with the Green New Deal and democratic socialism. And they have on camera, if you look at Project Veritas, which I'm sure you've seen, I know you have, where you have democratic socialists admitting that they're communists, admitting that they're these authoritarians, but they just believe that they can do it best. And I think that that's a good example of why communism has failed so hard throughout history, is that it is literally man playing God, but that level of power is addicting, which is why Lenin took so much of his focus on power. And it wasn't about the means, it wasn't about any justice or equality or anything of the sort that you hear preached from the talking sheep nowadays. And it was all about power, which is why when you get to the root of the incentive for these people that are in these factions now, it's like they don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. They think they're doing it out of empathy or compassion, but really it's all deriving from this power grab that they're after.
Oh, and I couldn't agree more. Lenin was incredibly intelligent when it came to taking the works of Karl Marx and adapting them into a political setting, as well as essentially what he did is he took an ideology and these people who were pretty much idealists, and all they had really was this movement that said this would be better for us, and had no real, I guess you could, no real plan as to putting it in place. And when Lenin comes along, just treats it like, I guess you could, he mobilizes that were willing to use force, that were willing to be the doers of the entire Bolshevik movement. Speaking about power, that's all this is about. So it's all about gaining power. And I think Lenin once said, it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how good you debate, it doesn't even matter how well you're liked. Just get the power, and if you have a problem, if somebody wants to debate you about it later, just shoot them because you have the power. So it's all a power grab, and we see this happening actually in the current crisis that we're in right now with this pandemic, where governments around the world are just power grabbing, and we're not going to get those liberties, no matter how small or insignificant they once seemed. We're not going to get those back. It's near impossible to get back any freedoms that the government has taken at any time. And one of the main goals of Lenin, or I guess you could say Marxist Leninist people, the Bolsheviks, was to remove any inclination that you could negotiate with the state. And what I mean by that is, if you weren't for the cause, they couldn't use you, and therefore they would just basically get rid of you. And I'm praying to God that that's not going to be taking place as soon as it looks like it's going to be taking place. With all these lockdowns and just the blatant misuse of authority, not really putting Americans on notice to say, hey, this is your responsibility. You can handle this. The greatest gift of freedom and liberty is responsibility and accountability. And once you shove those to the side or start delegating your power that you have, because the people have all the power, at least we used to. And once you start delegating that back into the hands of the government, you don't get it back. It then becomes the government has to have a I guess you could say a portion of society, if not all of society, who are breaking laws. That way, their existence is justified in a society like ours, where we have the Constitution, and so they continuously have to grow, and grow. And you really have seen it in the past decade, matter of fact, how the government has just been moving towards a lot of the strategies that Lenin used, and even Stalin, to remove all the power from the people, centralize it, and then, I guess you could say, come into the fold. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a great point. So the whole ideology of communism is man playing God, and whenever that happens, man isn't perfect, so there's going to be waste that builds up in that system that's not dependent on the natural functions of life, but it's more dependent on man's whim and man trying to attain power. So you're going to get this waste in the system. And I mean, it's like the adage that, order or an excess of order is wasteful, much like an excess of chaos is wasteful. So you got to find the right balance. And life naturally finds that right balance, but that's the free market. That's anarcho-capitalism. That's not the government enacting man's will on others. So you see these communist states that eventually have to start cleaning out the waste. And I mean, that's why you look at the body count for communism and it's through the roof.
Well, the body count for communism is far worse than any body count from any war.
Yeah.
I think all combined. A lot of people do not really pay attention, or maybe they don't know. They haven't been taught. Know that in school, for sure, public school, you do not learn about what happened to the bourgeoisie, as well as just the middle class in general. Whenever Trotsky, Lenin, and Stalin all came up through, the Bolshevik Revolution, where they started seizing farms, and I guess, kind of like communism being undefinable. Well, the bourgeoisie became undefinable because it eventually got to where, oh, well, you have this. Let's say that person may have not a lot, but more than the individual judging them on what they have, and considering what they have to be more and in line with the bourgeoisie who they hate. Therefore, it's like, oh, well, to the Gestapo you go, or sorry, Gestapo, to the Gulag you go, and or just summary executed. So I believe rough estimate, and this is a credible rough estimate of the amount of Russians who were killed, missing, murdered, or just dead from work camps under Stalin surpasses 50 million. Now, put that in perspective with what we understand about the 6 million people who were a part of the Holocaust. I believe it was something around 2 or 3 million Jewish and European Jews. And then you had the Gypsies. And then, just like in Russia, in Germany, what you had was they got rid of all the intellects. They got rid of the people who could oppose them and basically cause a rift in their entire plan, because you can get through the revolution, you can get into power, but if you're leaving these people who actually can make a difference, then you got to get rid of them. So these are kind of the uncounted bodies of wars, and it always ends up being the intellects or the scientists in some cases, and this kind of segues into how you end up actually controlling millions of people, although you're in the minority. And the Bolsheviks, although I believe that means the majority or whatever, they were the smallest party in Russia. But their propaganda campaign, sort of like Goebbels' propaganda campaign, it just captivated so many people. And what the Marxist Leninists do is they don't start these revolutions or even these silent revolutions whenever the economy is well, and you can actually come across this in the communist plan to overthrow, where it speaks about how, and they'll do everything to avoid calling it a successful capitalist moment. They call it a what's the correct terminology? They call it a temporary capitalist. I can't, without it in front of me, I can't remember. But it was in 1980 whenever these the American Communist Party was coming up, and they didn't, and being mostly Marxist without having the Leninist aspect of organizing and mobilizing, having that structure, and then the ability to take the works of Marx and use it effectively in the political arena, even at the local, school board level. They didn't have that. So in 1980, they wrote the Communist Overthrow, and it speaks about how you can't go up against people who don't share your same ideology. You have to wait till there's something like right now with the coronavirus dropping the world markets, and it looks like you got some contractions headed into a recession, most likely a depression later on, if we can't pull out of it in the fourth quarter. But that's what they strive on. They'll be the greatest American citizens in the world. You'll never suspect them of, being any type of Marxist or Leninist and on their way to communism. And they'll tell you exactly what you want to hear, because it's all in pursuit of power. It's all about grabbing the power, because once you have the power, you can't really be challenged. And that's why you see the left and the radical left, I'm going to use that term as it should be used, the radical left with the Green New Deal. You've seen, Pelosi try to push the Green New Deal through, basically holding a gun to the head of Congress, saying, hey, we're not going to pass a stimulus package unless you put in these just random funding mechanisms. And it's like, what are you doing? And that kind of actually shows you just a taste of what these people will be doing whenever they actually have more control. And God forbid they ever get it, because it'll change drastically. At first, it's silent. It's like a stealth bomber. You don't see it coming. it's they don't do revolutions anymore. It's all about infiltrating and then just biding your time. And that's where the faith just biding your time. Their symbol is the turtle. So you have to imagine the old kids' story about the tortoise and the hare. And that's the Fabian society. They're all about just gradualism. And that's what we've been seeing over the past 30 or 40 years is just that gradualism come in. And I'm really hoping that today we can enlighten a lot of people and show them how that gradualism just works its way in. And once it's there, it's near impossible to remove without extreme measures. The revolution.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic point. I mean, one of the things that I know comes up quite often when discussing authoritarianism is the Hegelian dialectic, and that it's, I mean, looking for a crisis is or waiting on a crisis or creating a crisis. It's the same means to an end, where it's the thesis plus antithesis equals synthesis. It's the way that you have leverage over people, and you can make them feel weaker, make them feel more powerless, so that then you feel like they're in a position where they want to be raised up, and if you can raise them up, then they'll look at you as being a leader or a figurehead. And I think it's interesting too. You bring up the Fabians. I mean, they got the name from General Flavius, who took on Hannibal. And when you know the story of Flavius, it makes a lot of sense why the Fabians took on that name, because General Flavius was really the originator of indirect warfare. So he would have controlled skirmishes, and it would be very small, and he would control pretty much both sides of the conflict, and he did that by essentially hiding all of the power that he had behind him. And he would even, go so far as to have some of them retreat, so that the enemy would think that they got an inch. They could now take a mile. Like they could start to let their guard down. And that's an instance where then the legions are unleashed on the enemy when their guard is down. So if you want to talk a little bit about the Fabians and how it connects to the Leninists and all of that, that'd be great.
Hey, no problem. So, the Fabian Socialist Society, or Society of Socialists, it's actually, I'm going to be honest, you know me, I'm a politico, and I give respect where respect is due. And the Fabians are the most successful political ideology, or they have the most successful political ideology I've ever come across. You kind of get envious because there's, when you think of the Chinese, they don't plan just 10 years down the road. They plan 50 to 100. And that's basically the same way that the Fabians operate, in that it doesn't matter how long it takes, as long as they're continuously moving towards their goal, and rarely do they fail. And part of the reason for that is because they don't just let in anybody. I mean, you got Tony Blair, who else? The Webbs. I mean, that was a very, very influential family back in the 19th century. H.G. Wells was a part of it for a short time. And George Bernard Shaw is the most outspoken member or founding member of the Fabian Society. I mean, he got to the point to where they didn't even really want him around because he was so guess you could say he was more Leninist than Fabian, because the whole goal with Fabianism was to take the world and shape it in their image. And this actually could be seen in the stained glass at the London School of Economics, where you have, I believe it's Arnold Toynbee and Mr. Webb on they have a glowing world on an anvil, and like a blacksmith's anvil. And, they got their hammers and they're shaping the world in their image, and it's just so revealing that I don't understand what appeals to anyone about any of these so-called ideologies of peace, because they're not. You could break this down into a few different ways, in the fact that the end goals, the way they operate, and even at present times, you could shoot all the way back to the Illuminati in Bavaria is where it started. Adam Weishaupt, everybody knows pretty much that story. If you don't, feel free to look it up. We're not here to actually get into the Illuminati in speculation. History. In France today, school children still learn about the Illuminati because after they were kicked out of Bavaria, they showed up in France and started the Jacobin revolt, where, I guess that would be where the king and queen lost, I guess that's Louis and Marie Antoinette lost their heads. And that's where all the priests were put into the guillotine. And if you remember, that was actually a motif this past year, this past election year, with one of the, I guess, candidates on the left running in a state seat, or maybe a congressional seat or something, where she had the guillotine as her camp. And it's all out in front of you if you just look, if you pay attention. Democratic social, there's no such thing. Okay, I guess there's a such thing until, after the first vote. After that, you could kiss it goodbye. See, Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky, they all wanted to basically create or states or whatever called socialist republics. Now, I know that sounds great, right? But in fact, it just, imagine the Baltics, all the states that the USSR swallowed after World War II. That would be what they were speaking of in regards to socialist republics. And people often misconstrue what Scandinavia is and call them Socialist Democrats or socialism. Every country has a bit of socialism, and you can only have as much socialism as there is a dominant culture to not only support it in most cases, but also agree to it, which is why Scandinavia works. It's not even a socialist country, but they have socialist programs. They have ways to pay for it. And they're all in agreement that that's what they want to do in their country. And then people also point to Sweden. Sweden's a fascist country. They allow private ownership of property. However, the difference between fascism and socialism, or Marxist, Leninist, all that, is the fact that with fascism, the the government only wants to manage the private property. That would be Sweden and some of those other Scandinavian countries. Now, with socialism, there is no private property. You don't own a house. I'm not even sure if you'd be able to own a car. I know in the old Soviet Union, back in, I think it was 1986 or 1983, if you you had to pay cash money up front for the car. But then it took 10 years to get the car. And it still wasn't yours. You had to pay for it, but it wasn't yours, is the way I understood it. And so the Fabians, their whole ordeal is gradualism. You know, one of their first symbols was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and then they switched to the turtle. And I could have that backwards, but I'm pretty sure I don't. And it's just they wanted to infiltrate just like Lenin did, but Lenin used the brute force politics and diplomacy, very deceptive diplomacy, to kind of get in those positions. The Fabians, however, they're not violent. I'm pretty sure that if you have a violent brother in your family, you don't have to be violent, do you? So, and then of course they're aristocratic, which is a paradox in the sense that it's always who call for socialism or fascism. And the reason for that is because they're the ones who will not have to abide by all the laws. They don't have to abide by the laws we have to abide by. They're usually the ones creating them. And, you just had those senators and congresswomen or whoever do all that inside trading. Now, if you or I went and did that, we'd go to jail. I mean, they even sent Martha Stewart to jail. But these guys aren't going to jail. And so, if you don't like how our government is set up now, then you need to imagine now times about 1,000, where you won't even get to gripe on Twitter. You won't even get to cancel anybody, because if you're supposed to be a party member and you're acting that way, they're going to kill you. They're either going to throw you in the gulag, or they're going to just summary execute you. They don't care. You're nobody. You are someone who's supposed to basically, think of it this way. The feminists do not like the patriarchy. Let me tell you something. Socialism is nothing but a patriarchy. Not to mention, you're not a human. You are a tool for the regime to expand its power and just continue expanding, and to continue this illusion that everything is okay and everything is working and we live in a socialist paradise. And that's what these rich people see, because that's what they will have. And to be honest, they don't even want you here. If you're some middle class person, they don't want you in their governments or in their state, in their realm, whatever, at all. And it's all about global governance. The goal has never changed. It's about world dominance the most, and I think we're actually seeing all that come to a head right now more than ever, because it's gotten to the point where we've lost all of our power to check them, because I guess it was Cicero said, if you don't worry about the things that happened before you were born, then you're doomed to be the victim of them. Basically saying, just because you didn't know about it before doesn't mean you shouldn't immediately take action as soon as you find out. And that's just one of the aspects of Fabianism, is that it seems, harmless and it seems okay, but there's always these undertones of like eugenics and the perfect race. And this is uniform through all of these, through fascism, through socialism, whatever you want to call it, socialism light, communist light. It doesn't matter. All ideologies that focus around lying and manipulating, deceiving, and basically centralizing power around a lot of times families and aristocrats. And in Russia's case, what had happened was it went from the communist regime to the oligarchs, where you had the corporations, which is kind of like what we're seeing right now, all these rich billionaires having essentially more power than politicians in regards to getting laws passed, because they have the money, the influence, and the power. So it's really just this system that works together. And like you mentioned, the Hegelian dialectic, look at America's two-party system. Now, more than two parties can exist, but only two parties are going to be presented for the people to make a choice. And that's the Hegelian dialectic. You got the antithesis, the thesis, and at the end you have the synthesis. So you have these two opposing forces. They're always in opposition, and you see that now also with the American people in regards to how divided we are over all this, because we have, I guess you could say a little bit more than half of the population that, I say half of the population, half of the voters who are really enthralled with, free stuff. They're one-issue voters, and they're more worried about abortion or all these things they call rights that are in no way rights. They're actually granted to you by the government, and not your non-creator or whatever you believe in, and they're falling victim to the entire, the scheme that people who want to grab power, even on the right, you can't look at the Republican side and say that there aren't, wolves in sheep's clothing over there. That would just, entire government, the way it's set up now, literally looks like, at this moment, a fascist government, where we're still allowed to have personal property, but the government does manage it in a lot of ways, because you have property tax, you have the Bureau of Land Management. If you don't pay your taxes, they could come take it away. It's not technically yours. You don't really have anything that's technically yours, because you get your vehicle taken away. You could get everything you own taken away, and you can get thrown in an MEU, which is one of those secret prison cells that they like to throw people like you and me in who constantly cause trouble. And so right now, we live, I guess you could say, in a quasi-fascist country, although it's the best quasi-fascist country in the world. And I wouldn't have it any other way other than it not being quasi-fascist. Every government is going to have, it's going to take the best, if it's a good government, implement it. There's nothing that says we can't have social programs. that we can't have social safety nets for people. But whenever you start incentivizing people to not work or to divorce their husbands or to have kids and no husband through social programs, and it doesn't matter how many people want to argue that's racist or that's not correct, it keeps up that Hegelian dialectic. And it also kind of creates, it also gives the illusion that there's this problem that they can fix. And that's why you always see I get what they used to call the liberals, or I say liberals, sorry, what they call the progressives, and that was always a really good check on the GOP and the conservatives, is you had a really logical, common sense left who would say, oh yeah, we don't need to go to war. But now we're at the point where you have nothing but power grabs. And like I said, it hasn't been witnessed more obvious than it has in the past 7, 8 to 10 years, where the left has constantly, and even the right, every chance they get, they sure do renew the FISA court, and they sure do renew the National Defense Authorization Act. So, and it kind of just, the young people really get deceived by it, because it's like, oh, free college, we'll forgive your loans. Well, if you stop and think, if someone's willing to forgive massive amount, I guess it would be $1 trillion in liability, or 1.5 to 2. If someone's willing to just jubilee that should tell you about not only their motives, because nobody does that just for the good of it. I'm sorry. I don't care how altruistic you think Trump is or anybody else. They're all scum, in my opinion. They're all corrupt, and I'd rather have Trump there because he's not the lesser of two evils. He's not really even evil. I was being pretty hyperbolic a second ago. But he actually stopped a lot of what they had planned in regards to moving that plan forward. And you could really look back, and if you just look back in retrospect and just kind of not nitpick, but if you just look at some of the laws that were passed and some of the relationships that they kept, and how the lobbyists were allowed to get away with as much stuff as they did, and then you have the bureaucrats, which is the real deep state, or the bureaucrats, the people, the holdovers you can't get rid of. And so that's exactly what the Fabians do. They infiltrate into every known position of influence, no matter how little or great it is. Same thing with power. And especially, they love education. And going back to the Illuminati, now, the Germans back in the day would order books, right? And, books were pretty expensive, magazines and books. What ended up happening was they had passed those same books around, and it got to the point to where they finally had enough money put together and saved their money, and then they took over that publication and would only publish, German authors or their friends or whatever. So that's kind of an example, a historical example of what really happens when individuals with nothing but power on the brain or power on their minds or money, what happens when they get into a position to where they can deny people, certain things, no matter how insignificant. I mean, these were books, but guess what? That's it. That was the information of the day. I believe this was back in the late 18th, early 19th century. And there's nothing you could do about it until you either remove them physically, vote them out, or, God forbid, something happens to where people have to die. And it's always my worst fear because, it's inevitable, and you hate to say that, and we try to do everything we can to stave that off, but whenever they control, the communications of the day, which we're also seeing right now on both sides, it's really hard to get the truth from either side. All you get really is propaganda. So, and what I want to kind of move into right now, since I'm on this subject, is civic virtue. And I know that we worked on civic virtue and the dissociative nature of self-involved sociopaths, and I think this would be actually a really good part for you, where you could pick that up, because this is kind of your baby.
Yeah, no, I think that in general, when you look at people who would fall victim to an authoritarian mindset, or who would think that the government can do something better than the free market, you're generally looking at idealists. I mean, and it's generally idealists who have a very unrealistic view of reality, where they think that they can get something for nothing. I mean, it's the same thing like when you're talking about universal health care, and the first thing that Saul Alinsky says is that, if you want to control the people, control the health care, because you're literally controlling their life. And I thought it was funny the way that when universal health care talks came up, especially around like Obamacare, you had all these people saying that there were going to be death panels with the government, and they're going to get to decide who lives and who dies. And the Democratic Socialists and the progressives were saying, no, that's not how it is. You're making it all up. It's all fabricated. It's just lies. But resources are not infinite. You're going to have death panels. You're going to have a government agency that decides where resources get allocated, because they're not limitless. And if you don't have the free market determining where those resources go, then you have a redistribution of the pay scale, which literally means you're stealing from somebody to give to someone else. And there was actually a Karl Marx quote that came up when you were discussing the children, and it made me think of it, so I'm going to read it here. He says, "The education of all children, from the moment that they can get along without a mother's care, shall be in state institutions." And I think that perfectly paints the way that they're not only controlling history, but they're controlling the way that it's taught to kids and the way that their worldview is set as they're growing up. And, when you get into the dissociative nature of self-involved sociopaths, well, okay, for starters on that, do you want to just define exactly what a sociopath is for people?
So, a sociopath is like a psychopath, except a psychopath is born that way. They have I believe it may be an actual physical defect in the brain. I said psychopath, right?
Yes.
Damn. Oh, I'm going to go back.
Okay.
I'm glad you asked that, because without having a dictionary in front of me, I'm going to do my best to explain what a sociopath is, and it's probably not going to be 100% correct, but I know I'll do a good job. So you have sociopath, psychopath. Socio, you can relate that to society, the environment. It could be the cause of, let's say, being raised in the ghetto and having to live a certain way. And I do not judge anyone who has come from a hard way of life. You will actually do better in life than most people. So a psychopath, you have to think psychology. They actually have a defect, a mental defect, a physical defect, most likely on the brain or some type of injury that affects the brain, where they do not respond at all the same ways that you or I respond. And sociopaths can actually be cured, from what I understand. It's more of a choice. Like whenever I guess I've told everybody, I'm a recovering narcissist. You could consider a narcissist a sociopath. We don't care who we step on, what we have to do. We're going to achieve whatever we set out to achieve, whether it's getting a cheeseburger or, making it up to CEO. If I have to, I guess you could say screw your wife or something, I would do it if I were a sociopath. But that's a choice I know I'm making. Psychopaths aren't really like that. Do they feel regret? Probably not. So, getting into these self-involved sociopaths, basically what you're talking about is a narcissist. Just if you want to kind of break it down into terms everybody understands, a narcissistic personality disorder where we'll manipulate you, we'll do anything we can to achieve the goal we've set out to achieve, even if it's just to deceive you, even if it's just to deceive or lie. As long as we're successful, we'll do whatever it takes. So that's why I constantly try to remain humble and keep my ego in check, because I never want to go back to being a narcissist. It's like, look, in retrospect, what happens is it's almost like you're a passenger in your own body, except you're really not, because you're making all those choices, and you've made choice after choice after choice, and you haven't been checked, kind of like the government. You've had no checks, and it basically, the reason that happens is because, oh, your mommy's little boy or your daddy's little girl, and you're just the best in the world, and you got participation trophies. I never got any. I always placed no less than third. Anyways, as a joke, ego pun. But so that's kind of what builds that sociopath. And there's been this really big debate with political civility, and has political civility died? Is it dead? Where's the civility? I'm just going to be the bearer of bad news really fast for anyone who believes in civility in politics, or civility in the discussion of politics, anything to do with politics. It's never existed. Back in the 18th century and 19th century, our representatives would shoot each other. There's never been political civility. That is a myth. It's something used to reinforce an Hegelian dialectic. It creates a problem, just like everything else they do in the media. It creates sides. You're going to choose a side, and therefore you have an antithesis, a thesis, and at the end you'll have the synthesis. So I'm going to send it back to you and let you go into this.
Yeah, no, I think that you made a lot of great points there. There's a lot to hit on, but I think that one of the biggest revelations that I remember having going through political philosophy is that when people strive to be more moral, like when that's set as the goal, they tend to be the most immoral, because they see themselves as everything they do is good, and anything that someone does that disagrees with what they do is evil. And when you place things into good and evil in the terms of man, you're basically playing a power game at that point. And so I think that's kind of the dissociative nature of sociopaths, is that, I think you have a lot of people who get duped and maybe don't even know why they're duped. They think it's reality. They think it's their worldview, but really they're just stuck in the mindset of thinking everything that they do is good, which is very similar to the way that when a liberal institution is put in place, it immediately starts to degrade itself. because putting it in place, it's like the process of getting it in place was the growing period. But once it's in place, it starts to remove the stresses that caused it to be instituted in the first place. And I think that, when you look at different governments and the way that they don't roll back anything that they do, which is something we mentioned earlier in this chat, that, government never rolls itself back. So everything that they do, every move they make is further burdening the people, except for very, very rare instances where government might be rolled back for the purpose of not making the people overzealous or making the people a little bit too concerned about their government. If anything, it's that Fabian tactic of giving them a little bit to make them think that they're in control and they let their guard down, and then you come at them full bore when you have a pandemic or you have some issue like 9/11. And I mean, it's quite literally the virtue death of humanity, where you have people who believe that they are doing everything good that they can possibly do, and they're being these virtuous beacons of hope. And it's because they're sociopaths that have dissociated themselves from history and from their true intentions. So I'll throw it back to you to discuss that a little bit more.
I couldn't agree more. That was actually a very well articulated analysis. You know me. I have a lot of trouble articulating, so sometimes I take the long way around. But no, that's actually pretty accurate. And that, I mean, I know that's kind of how a lot of people view themselves, as being altruistic. And in my experience, those are the people who often ended up, screwing me over or screwing somebody I knew over, because they would find they were so good, they judged people, and they would find something wrong with the other person, and it kind of like a projection almost. They would project not what they did wrong, but what they know is wrong within themselves. They might see it in that person and then reject them. And that's kind of what sociopaths do as well, is they project. And we've seen that a lot in the past couple of years with, you had Hillary projecting the whole Russia thing while she was the one who did, oversaw the uranium one. And then you had all the other politicians and pundits constantly projecting a lot of who they were onto their victim. And I'm not saying their victim is innocent by any stretch of the imagination, but luckily that's not how we work in a free society where we value liberty, sovereignty, and personal human rights above people's opinions about them or the offenses received regarding those opinions. And it just goes to show you that you'll never actually get away from people who value what they believe more than others. And this is why it's absolutely important to suspend all thought, all teaching, everything that has to do with subjective reality. It doesn't exist. It only feeds the delusion further. And what I mean by that is, let's take flat Earth, for example. I made the mistake once of saying, Schrodinger's cat, the cat's not dead because he put it in a box. It's not dead until you observe it. Okay. Well, the Earth, I told one of the flat earthers, I'm like, well, I guess, the Earth's not round or flat until you directly observe it. Big mistake. You're not supposed to do that. And that kind of goes into the subjective reality that a lot of parents, a lot of teachers, a lot of role models, It's all about, oh, well, if you feel that it's okay, then it must be okay. Or just this whole lovey-dovey, it's all about love, it's all about feel good. And that's not life. That's why these Generation Z I like to separate millennials in two classes. The post 1993 and the prior 1993. I fit in the prior 1993, and most of us, we're pretty headstrong, got our head on straight. Not all of us, and sometimes we struggle. But after that, what happens is you have the generation of safe playgrounds where they actually had to go in and make the playgrounds unsafe because kids were going home and getting hurt because they knew no risk. They couldn't test their boundaries. Like Jordan Peterson said, that you have to let them roughhouse. And you have to, that's all throughout life. You have to let us roughhouse. You can't micromanage us in the sense that we shouldn't be allowed to be offended, or we shouldn't be allowed, or we shouldn't not be able to offend other people as long as we're not physically harming them. I don't know if you remember, but shortly after Christian Bale filmed the first installment of the new Batman flicks, he went back to Great Britain or wherever he's from over there, and he yelled at his wife and his mother and was put in jail for assault. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine using your First Amendment, your freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and then being thrown in jail over what you said because either who you said it to was offended, and even worse, someone around you may have been offended that you had no clue was there? And that is, that social justice for one, and that's actually one of the, foundational pillars of this whole, I'm just going to stick with collectivist movement, is social justice. Because if you can get social justice enacted, what you do is you start, for one, you start bringing in the marginalized minority, and then people begin to get used to it or whatever. And so by the time it's all said and done, you end up with red flag laws. You end up with people calling things hate speech that are not hate speech. There's actually no such thing as hate speech other than violent speech, which are two distinctly different things. And this is that dissociative part of not only being a sociopath, but just being alive today almost. Because no longer do we disagree politically, religiously, pretty much about anything, and then still go to one another's house after like a knockdown, drag out argument, have a beer, break some bread, whatever. That very rarely happens. Now, if you see it happen, it's usually people like yourself who have your head on, and then mostly the pre-93, pre-95 millennial range, and everybody before that. Although, not everybody. If you're one of the individuals who has not yet been able to accept that Donald Trump is president, he's not going anywhere, you may disagree with him, and you may actually believe the propaganda that is on the news on either side, and therefore you're only making your dissociative nature worse because you won't interact in a healthy and positive way. Whether or not you're arguing with that person, that's still very positive as long as you continue that dialogue, but you're only further distancing yourself from a problem that has to be addressed. And then this is what the collectivists love. They love it when it's like this, because they don't have to work, they don't have to contend with the economy if more, let's say 30% of the population is unhappy because they've fallen into this just vicious cycle of social justice, cancel, cancel, cancel. That's on both sides, by the way. That's not just some progressive or lefty thing. That's also on the right. And that's how divided we really are, because people will get on Twitter or get on YouTube and, thinking they're anonymous because they don't know you and me. We can find out who they are at any time. But thinking they're anonymous and just letting you have it, speaking to you like you just killed their dog or something, all because you may have cracked a joke or, criticized their favorite YouTuber because they're all fanboy and fangirl about it, and they get offended for other people, which is also another sign of narcissism, because you want to be the center of attention, and therefore if you're offended and you're playing the victim, then the attention is all yours, and it feeds into that narcissistic personality disorder, which further disassociates you from reality. And this also comes in, absolutism comes into this. You don't have to be religious, spiritual. You don't have to believe in God, whatever. I do. I'm a Christian. Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. I have an absolute. I have a moral compass. Whereas before, whenever I was, just always trying to disprove God, I had none. And that really fed into that sociopath, dissociative nature of narcissism. And it made it worse, and it made it worse, and it made it worse. I'm not saying that you're that way because you don't have a higher calling, but it sure does help to not tear down institutions that serve a far more of a purpose in society than just a religious purpose. These are the institutions like the church, the school, and all these, what are they, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. These are institutions that are outlets and then socializing mechanisms that give you an anchor in a place where you may not have an anchor otherwise. Feminists have their thing. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with socializing with people who are like-minded. But if that's all you ever socialize with, you will never have an objective reality experience while you're doing it. You may think you do. You may think that you understand exactly what the deal is, geopolitics, domestic politics. You may actually believe in the disinformation a lot of times that comes out. I've been the victim of it. Heck, Ben knows. Whenever I was really looking into propaganda, I basically brainwashed myself, and I thought government was just, oh my God, it was a horrible situation. It almost just made me have a nervous breakdown. And we're seeing kids actually have nervous breakdowns who have to take leave of absence from like high school and middle school because of this, because they're so socially distanced, to use Fauci and all them words, that they're not interacting with anyone, and therefore they only have themselves essentially to talk to, and other people just like them. And to put this into perspective, think about, that if you type or if you send out a tweet, a specific type of tweet aimed at a specific demographic, or even person, you're going to get a response back. That is the exact same as talking to yourself. You're just reaffirming, it's like a confirmation bias. And this all leads into the fact that we have no civility issues. We have a dissociative issue, and it's becoming very, very unhealthy for the country, because you can see it whenever people are clearing shelves with people behind them not caring about, their fellow man. Whereas I know back when I was growing up, I was born in '84. There were some times we got stuck in places where, like, there was a hurricane or something. No one ever cleared a shelf until everybody that was around or something got something, And it just speaks volumes to the state of society whenever it's being played into this socialist, communist, democratic socialist republic agenda, this Jacobite, rebellion, where the whole entire goal is to destroy the current government, whether it be capitalism or whatever, and just essentially fracture the entire society. And that's what we're seeing now. So I'd like you to actually go on with this civic virtue conversation, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I think you covered a lot of it there very well. This might actually be a good place to stop. The last thing, though, that I will say, just to put the Hegelian dialectic into perspective for people, is, it should be realized that, and I think I mentioned this in one of the Enemy of the State podcasts that I did, talking about the utility of evil. And it's the same thing like the utility of war, where you have the thesis, the antithesis, and then the synthesis, where the value of war is to prolong the instincts that led to that war. So it's when you have the constant clashing, you have the stress on one side pushing on the other side, and then you have the stress on the other side pushing on the first side. So they feed each other. So when you look at mainstream media and you see, oh, well, Fox News is conservative and CNN is liberal, and it's like, well, they're both mainstream media, It's two sides of the same war.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more. And on that point, I want to actually point this out. A lot of people don't understand that there are no more virtuous wars. There's not. We've reached the point now where the world would actually be better off without a world police, without a UN. It would be better off. And so, to kind of go off of what you said about the wars and stuff, if you actually look throughout history and actually dig up the documents, because they do exist. They exist like, the phone or computer, the sound you're hearing right now. And it's not a conspiracy. I get really tired of people touting like a Jewish conspiracy. I fell into that camp, and that was like the most ignorant thing I've ever done in my entire life. Because you see what you want to see. And if you're looking for a conspiracy, not a conspiracy like, your wife is cheating on you with your best friend. That's a conspiracy. There's two people there, whatever. I'm talking about just crazy, oddball theories about how, we funded both sides of the war. Well, let me tell you a secret about why we funded, like Russia. Even while we're in Vietnam and during the Cold War, and even before that, back after the Bolshevik Revolution, whenever Lenin decided, hey, we actually need the West help. We just killed all the farmers. We can't grow potatoes, salad, any of that stuff. So when Wall Street and all the investors went over there to do what's called a 5-year plan, they set up infrastructure, modernized their fuel production, all of it. Now, why did they do that? Even though, like, if you're smart, you can surmise that we were going to end up going to war with them. Our sense of patriotism isn't the same. Theirs is to the state. Ours is protecting our own sovereignty as a person, while also understanding that while protecting our sovereignty, our liberty, our freedom, we're also protecting, everyone else's, because that's the responsibility we have is to protect and look out for ourselves, not being selfish. But you get the point. And if you do that, that also impacts everyone else. So we actually funded Russia during the Vietnam War, who then gave those trucks that they were building in the Gorick factory, which they called the Italian Fiat car factory. It's an inside joke in the government. But they were shipping those cars, and pilots were flying over and saying, "Hey, why are there American vehicles delivering supplies to the North Vietnamese?" And that's why, because we were funding what's called a captive state, where we didn't need another America. That would have been worse than the Cold War, because another America would have actually more than likely led to a hot war. Therefore, we would actually, export a lot of our stuff over to countries like that, because they, for one, were socialist, communist, Leninist, whatever, and they had no exports. They couldn't grow enough food, so we had to ship it in. They had no manufacturing, which is why it took 10 years to get a car. And it's just ridiculous the amount people neglect to understand or even acknowledge, because that's what socialism does. There's been no successful country in modern history that has practiced socialism as they want to practice it today. It leads to communism. That's the end goal. That's what they never tell you. That's why those people who were actually communists or social Leninists could lie under oath and not be lying, because they weren't communists. Communism is an end goal. That's the utopia. It hasn't happened yet. And it's just really important for people to just throw out those conspiracies about funding both sides. That's why both sides were funded in almost every war with communism, or even in the Middle East. If you don't fund both sides, you can't control your opposition, which is actually a Lenin tactic. It's better to control your opposition than to empower them by attacking them or whatever. And so, yes, we funded the Russians, or the USSR at that time, who were then supplying the North Vietnamese. That's just kind of how it works. Sad that it happened, but me and disinformation, and YouTube is just, for some reason getting worse and worse as this coronavirus just kind of spreads. And the whole QAnon thing, you know how much I hate that guy or whoever it is, because those are the people who act like communists or national socialists. Try and correct one of them, and they will threaten your life or just all out attack you, call you a shill, all kinds of stuff. And that's the kind of mentality that spawns movements that seek refuge in things like authoritarian regimes. So it's important to understand all the facts, investigate, be skeptical, and understand why a power or a person would do a thing or want to do a thing. And if you can surmise what they gain by wanting to do it, you can tell their intent. So I just wanted to end on that note about us supplying our alleged enemy. Well, there are enemies, but that's why. It's to keep them in the state they're in because we don't want competition.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's a fantastic point to end this on because, we started with the history of communism and communist ideology and, all of its different facets and then kind of moved into more modern times and how we're seeing it play out today. And I think that's a beautiful picture to paint for people. So thank you for coming on, Chad. I greatly appreciate the talk.
I mean, I got to go back in the cage, man. I appreciate it, Ben. That was a great talk, and I hope everybody out there understands my points. I have an articulation problem, which is why Ben and his moneymaker is always making that money. All right, there, buddy.